Some transactions change more than ownership. They rewrite the rules of an entire territory. When the most dangerous man in the Southwest was chained to an auction block, nobody expected a quiet woman with a teacher's salary to bid her entire life savings. What happened next would shake the foundations of Fort Prescott and prove that courage sometimes wears a schoolmarm's dress and speaks in a voice barely above a whisper. This is the story of how one impossible decision transformed two broken lives into a legend that still echoes through Arizona history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October sun hammered down on Fort Prescott Central Plaza with the kind of merciless intensity that made even the lizards seek shelter. Dust devils spun lazy patterns across the packed earth, and the air shimmered with heat that turned distant mountains into wavering mirages. It was 1886, and the Apache Wars had finally ground to their bitter conclusion. The gathered crowd represented every social stratum of territorial Arizona. Ranchers in sweat-stained hats, merchants in their Sunday vests despite the weekday heat, soldiers in uniforms that had seen too many campaigns, and women clutching parasols that provided pathetic defense against the relentless October blaze. This wasn't a cattle auction or a land sale. This was something darker, something that drew spectators the way carrion draws vultures. The territorial legislature had passed a new law just 3 months prior, a legal innovation that allowed captured hostiles to be sold into supervised labor contracts rather than languishing in military prisons that were overcrowded and expensive to maintain. Governor Thornton himself had called it a humanitarian measure, a way to allow former warriors to contribute to the society they'd once fought against. Others called it slavery by another name, but those voices were few and easily drowned out by the chorus of settlers who'd lost family. Members to Apache raids, the auction platform, had been hastily constructed from raw lumber that still wept sap in the heat. It stood in the shadow of the territorial courthouse, a 2-story adobe structure that represented the fragile reach of American law into lands that had belonged to other peoples for centuries beyond counting. Round the plaza's perimeter, cavalry troops stood at loose attention, their carbines held casually but their eyes sharp. They weren't expecting trouble, but with Apaches you never knew. Major William Dalton presided over the proceedings with the grim efficiency of a man who'd stopped questioning his orders years ago. He was 43, with a face carved by 2 decades of frontier service into something resembling weathered granite. His uniform was immaculate despite the heat, buttons gleaming, creases sharp enough to cut paper. He'd fought Apaches in 3 territories, lost friends to their raids, and buried soldiers who died screaming with arrows in their guts. If he felt any moral ambiguity about what he was about to do, it didn't show in his steel-gray eyes. The man chained to the iron post at the platform's center made the spectacle complete. Nahilzai, this name meant he who moves like wind in the Chiricahua dialect, stood perfectly still despite the chains that bound his wrists to the heavy ringbolt. He was somewhere in his late 20s, though the exact age was anyone's guess. The Apaches didn't mark time the way white men did. He stood just under 6 feet tall, unusual height for his people, with shoulders that spoke of years carrying impossible burdens across impossible terrain. His skin was the color of copper, darkened by desert sun and campfire smoke, stretched over muscles that were lean and hard as mesquite wood. His face would have been called handsome by any objective standard, with high cheekbones, a straight nose, and a jaw that could have been carved from stone. But it was his eyes that captured attention and held it, dark as obsidian, deep as canyon shadows, and utterly devoid of fear. They swept across the crowd with neither hatred nor pleading, just a kind of distant assessment, as if he were memorizing faces for some future reckoning. His hair hung past his shoulders, black as a raven's wing, bound back with a strip of leather that had seen better days. He wore canvas trousers and a rough cotton shirt, both provided by the army after they'd burned his traditional clothing. His feet were bare despite the scorching platform planks, and he stood with a stillness that was somehow more threatening than any display of aggression could have been. The scars told their own story. A puckered bullet wound on his left shoulder, a long knife slash across his ribs, smaller marks that spoke of thorns, rocks, and the countless small violences of a life lived in constant motion across the harshest landscape in North America. His hands were calloused in ways that came from handling weapons and working rawhide, from climbing cliffs and gripping horse manes during rides that would kill softer men. Major Dalton cleared his throat and unrolled a document that had been prepared by the territorial secretary. His voice carried clearly across the plaza, practiced from years of issuing commands on battlefields where hesitation meant death. By order of the territorial governor and pursuant to Legislative Act 47 of 1886, the individual known as Nahilzai, also called Windwalker, Apache male of approximately 28 years, is hereby offered for supervised labor contract to any citizen of good standing willing to assume responsibility for his custody and productive employment. The major paused, letting his gaze sweep the crowd. This individual is classified as a hostile combatant with confirmed participation in raids against civilian settlements. His record includes the following incidents: participation in the attack on the Henderson Ranch in Pima County, resulting in property destruction; involvement in the ambush of a supply wagon near Tucson, resulting in the deaths of 2 teamsters; and leadership of a band that evaded cavalry pursuit for 14 months across 3 territories. Someone in the crowd spat tobacco juice into the dust. A woman clutched her husband's arm tighter, remembering her own close call with Apache raiders 3 years prior. The soldiers shifted their weight, hands moving unconsciously toward their weapons. Dalton continued, "The contract term is set at 10 years of supervised labor. The purchaser assumes full responsibility for the individual's custody, including prevention of escape and ensuring compliance with all territorial laws. The purchaser will provide adequate food, shelter, and working conditions, as defined by territorial statute. Any violation of these terms will result in forfeiture of the contract and return of the individual to military custody." He paused for effect, then added the detail everyone was waiting for. "The individual will remain shackled at all times, except when performing labor under direct supervision. He is not to be armed under any circumstances. He is not to have unsupervised contact with other Apache individuals or known sympathizers. Violation of these conditions will be treated as aiding an enemy combatant and prosecuted accordingly." The crowd murmured, a low sound like distant thunder. These were harsh terms, but then again, this was a harsh land that had been soaked in blood on both sides for longer than most could remember. Nahilzai stood through this recitation like a statue carved from dark stone. His face betrayed nothing, no anger, no fear, no resignation. He might have been listening to a discussion of the weather for all the reaction he showed, but those who looked closely might have noticed the slight tension in his jaw, the way his fingers flexed once against the chains before going still again. In the crowd, a rancher named Thomas Crawford nudged his neighbor. "Crazy business, this. What man in his right mind would bring an Apache onto his property? Might as well invite a rattlesnake into your bed." His neighbor, a freighter named Dutch Herman, nodded agreement. "Heard he killed 6 soldiers during his capture. Took a whole company to bring him down, and even then, they only got him because he was trying to protect some women and children who couldn't run anymore. Men like that, you turn your back on him once, you won't get a chance to regret it." The murmur of similar conversations rippled through the assembled crowd. Everyone knew stories about Nahilzai. Some were probably true. Many were certainly exaggerated. But truth and legend had a way of bleeding together on the frontier, and the result was a reputation that preceded him like the smell of gunpowder. Major Dalton raised his hand for silence. Opening bid is set at $50, reflecting the high-risk nature of this contract and the individual's documented hostility. Do I have $50? The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. $50 was real money, more than a month's wages for most men. And what were you buying for that? 10 years of labor from a man who'd proven time and again that he was smarter, faster, and more dangerous than anyone who'd tried to cage him. A man who'd choose death over submission without a second thought. A man who might smile at you one morning and slit your throat that same afternoon. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Several men who'd come with vague intentions of bidding suddenly found their boots fascinating. A merchant who'd lost a warehouse to Apache fire crossed his arms and shook his head slowly. The math didn't work. The risk was too high. The potential for disaster was too obvious. Dalton tried again, a note of impatience creeping into his military monotone. $50 for a 10-year contract. That's $5 per year, gentlemen. You couldn't hire a half-lame Mexican for that rate. This individual is proven capable of surviving in conditions that would kill most men. He can track, hunt, read terrain like a book. Put him to work on your ranch, and you'll get value that far exceeds the purchase price. Still silence. A horse stamped and snorted at the hitching rail. A baby cried somewhere in the crowd and was quickly hushed. The sun continued its merciless assault on anything foolish enough to stand in its light. Crawford leaned toward Herman again, speaking low. Watch. Dalton will have to drop the price or send the Apache back to the stockade. Nobody's fool enough to buy trouble with their own money. But Crawford was wrong about the fool part. The voice came from the far edge of the crowd, clear and steady, despite its feminine pitch. I bid $50. Every head turned as one, like a field of sunflowers following the sun. The crowd parted slowly, reluctantly, as a woman made her way forward. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the assembly like wildfire through dry grass. That's Miss Eleanor Hartwell, the school teacher. What in God's name does she think she's doing? Eleanor Hartwell was 31 years old, though most people would have guessed younger. She stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, with a slender build that spoke of someone who'd never known true physical hardship, but had never indulged in softness either. Her hair was dark brown, almost black, pulled back in a severe bun that was the standard style for respectable women of her profession. Her dress was grey cotton, high-necked and long-sleeved despite the heat, with only a simple cameo brooch at her throat to suggest any vanity. Her face was what people called handsome rather than pretty, strong bones, a straight nose, a determined chin. Her eyes were her most striking feature, a deep hazel that shifted between green and brown, depending on the light. Right now, in the harsh October sun, they were the color of jade, and they fixed on Major Dalton with an intensity that made the battle-hardened officer blink. She carried a small leather purse in both hands, held at her waist with the prim propriety that she brought to everything she did. Her back was straight as a rifle barrel, her shoulders squared, her chin raised just enough to signal determination without arrogance. Major Dalton stared at her as if she'd just sprouted wings. "Miss Hartwell, I'm not certain you understand the nature of this proceeding." "I understand perfectly, Major. You're auctioning a labor contract for a 10-year term. I'm bidding $50. Is my money not as good as anyone else's?" Her voice carried clearly, and it held an edge that made several men in the crowd suddenly remember their own school days and teachers who'd wielded rulers like cavalry sabers. There was steel in that voice, despite its cultured Eastern accent and proper diction. Dalton recovered his composure, but his discomfort was obvious. "Miss Hartwell, with all due respect, this individual is extremely dangerous. He's a proven hostile with a documented history of violence. This is not like hiring a man to split firewood or tend a garden. I'm aware of that, Major. I read the territorial newspapers. I'm also aware that my bid is valid under the law, and that the statute makes no distinction based on the gender of the bidder. So I'll ask again, do you accept my bid of $50, or should I take my concerns about sex-based discrimination to the territorial governor?" The crowd erupted in a buzz of shocked conversation. Women didn't speak to army majors this way. Women, particularly unmarried women, didn't involve themselves in such affairs. And women certainly didn't. stand in the middle of a public plaza and announce their intention to purchase the custody of the most dangerous Apache warrior in the territory. Dalton looked desperately around the crowd, hoping that some man, any man, would raise the bid and save him from this absurd situation. But the men of Fort Prescott seemed to have collectively lost their voices. They stared at the schoolteacher with expressions that ranged from shock to horror to reluctant admiration. On the platform, Nahilzai's eyes had found Eleanor Hartwell. For the first time since being chained to the post, something flickered across his face. Not quite surprise, but perhaps the faint echo of curiosity. He studied her with the same intensity he might give to tracking sign in difficult terrain, reading something in her bearing that others might miss. Dalton made one last attempt. "Miss Hartwell, even if I accept your bid, and I'm not saying I will, you must understand that this individual requires constant supervision. You live alone in the schoolhouse. You have no male relatives in the territory to assist you. The practical difficulties alone make this impossible." Eleanor's chin came up another notch. "I live alone by choice, Major, not by inability to manage my own affairs. As for supervision, I'm certain I can secure appropriate assistance should it be needed. And I must point out that you've already stated the terms of the contract make the purchaser responsible for custody. If I'm assuming that legal responsibility, I fail to see how the practical arrangements are any concern of yours." She opened her purse and removed a small leather wallet. From it, she counted out 5 $10 gold pieces, placing them carefully on the edge of the platform where Dalton could see them clearly. The coins gleamed in the sunlight, undeniable proof that her bid was serious. $50 in gold, Major. I believe that's the opening bid you requested. Unless someone wishes to offer more. The challenge hung in the air like gunsmoke. Every man present knew that if they bid now, they'd be competing against a woman. And if they won, they'd be the man who'd pushed aside a respectable schoolteacher to buy an Apache. If they didn't bid, they'd be acknowledging that they were more afraid of Nahilzai than a woman was. It was a masterful trap, and Eleanor had sprung it with the precision of a chess grandmaster. The silence stretched on for nearly a minute. Dalton's face went through several interesting color changes, settling finally on a resigned pale gray. He looked once more at the assembled crowd, saw nothing but averted eyes and shuffling feet, and then turned his gaze back to Eleanor Hartwell. $50 going once, he said, his voice hollow. Going twice. Another pause, longer this time, a final desperate hope that someone would rescue him from this disaster. Sold to Miss Eleanor Hartwell for $50. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that sounded like a rifle shot in the sudden quiet. And just like that, the most dangerous Apache warrior in the Arizona Territory became the legal responsibility of a spinster schoolteacher from Massachusetts, who barely came up to his shoulder and probably weighed less than the pack he'd carried through his years of raiding. The aftermath of the sale rippled through the crowd like waves spreading from a stone thrown into still water. Women clustered together in tight knots, their voices rising in scandalized whispers. Men stood in awkward silence, caught between the desire to protest and the embarrassment of having been outmaneuvered by someone they dismissed as a harmless bluestocking. The cavalry troopers exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their opinion of this entire fiasco. Major Dalton gathered the gold coins with hands that weren't entirely steady. He dropped them into a leather pouch, sealed it with a wax stamp bearing the territorial seal, and then turned to face Eleanor with an expression that mixed military discipline with personal disapproval in equal measures. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Miss Hartwell, I'll need you to sign the contract documents. I must also inform you that by accepting custody of this individual, you're assuming complete legal responsibility for his actions. If he escapes, you'll be liable for damages. If he harms anyone, you'll face criminal charges as an accessory. If he dies while under your care through neglect or abuse, you'll answer for that as well. Do you understand the full weight of what you're accepting? Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. I understand completely, Major. If you'll direct me to the documents, I'll sign them immediately. A clerk emerged from the courthouse, carrying a leather portfolio stuffed with papers. He spread them across a makeshift table, his hands fumbling slightly as he tried to avoid looking at either Eleanor or the chained Apache. The documents were dense with legal language, full of whereas clauses and party of the first-part declarations that would have given most people pause. Eleanor read through each page, with the same careful attention she brought to grading her students' compositions. She took her time, ignoring the impatient shuffling of feet around her, the whispered conversations that grew louder with each passing minute. When she finally reached for the pen the clerk offered, her hand was perfectly steady. Her signature flowed across the bottom of each page in the clear, elegant script that came from years of writing on chalkboards and correcting essays. Eleanor Grace Hartwell. Each letter formed with precision. No flourishes or unnecessary decoration, just clean efficiency that somehow suited her perfectly. As she signed the final page, she became aware that Nahilzai was watching her, not with the distant assessment he'd shown the crowd, but with something sharper, more focused. She looked up from the documents and met his eyes directly for the first time. What passed between them in that moment would be impossible to describe adequately. It wasn't an attraction, nothing so simple or conventional. It was more like the recognition that passes between two pieces of flint before they strike together to make fire. An acknowledgement of potential, of possibility, of consequences that neither could yet fully understand. Eleanor was the first to break the gaze, turning back to Major Dalton with the same composure she'd maintained throughout. I assume there are keys for the shackles. Dalton's jaw tightened. Miss Hartwell, I strongly advise you to keep him restrained at all times. The contract requires adequate treatment and working conditions, Major. I've read the statute. A man cannot work efficiently if he's chained like a dog. I'll keep the restraints available should circumstances require them, but I see no reason to begin with unnecessary humiliation. The Major's face flushed. With all due respect, ma'am, you don't know what you're dealing with. This isn't some reservation Indian who's been broken to white man's ways. This is Nahilzai. He's killed more men than you've probably met in your lifetime. He's escaped from military custody twice before. He's my legal responsibility now, Major, as you've taken considerable pains to remind me. So unless there's some legal requirement for the restraints beyond your personal recommendation, I'll thank you for providing the keys. For a long moment, Dalton simply stared at her, struggling with the urge to refuse, to protect this foolish woman from her own naive idealism. But the law was clear, and Eleanor Hartwell had followed every letter of it. He nodded curtly to one of the soldiers, who stepped forward with a ring of iron keys. The soldier approached Nahilzai with visible reluctance, his rifle held ready in one hand, while he fumbled with the keys in the other. He unlocked the wrist shackles first, then the chain that bound the Apache to the post. The heavy iron fell away, clanging against the wooden platform with a sound that made several spectators flinch. Nahilzai brought his hands forward slowly, rubbing his wrists where the metal had left deep red marks in his copper skin. He rolled his shoulders, working out the stiffness that came from standing motionless for hours. Then he straightened to his full height and looked at Eleanor Hartwell with an expression that might have been respect or might have been calculation, possibly both. Eleanor studied him with the same careful attention she'd given to the contract documents. Up close, the scars were more visible, the signs of a life lived in constant danger more apparent. But she also noticed things that the gawking crowd had missed. The intelligence in those dark eyes, the controlled grace in every small movement, the dignity that chains and captivity hadn't managed to break. Can you understand English? She asked, her voice pitched low enough that only he and the nearest soldiers could hear. Yes. His voice was deep, rough from disuse, colored by an accent that turned the simple word into something that sounded almost like music. It was the first word anyone had heard him speak since his capture 3 months prior. Good. That will make things simpler. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. I'm Eleanor Hartwell. I teach at the Territorial School. You're going to be living at the schoolhouse and helping with various tasks as we determine what's most useful. I expect honesty, reasonable effort, and no violence except in direct self-defense. In return, you'll have adequate food, shelter, and as much freedom as the law allows. Do you understand? Nahilzai studied her face for a long moment before responding. I understand the words. I do not understand why. It was a fair question. Eleanor had asked herself the same thing 100 times since making the decision to come here today. She didn't have a simple answer then, and she didn't have one now. But she had something, at least, because what's being done here is wrong. Because you're a human being, not livestock. Because I have the means to prevent one injustice, even if I can't fix the larger problem. Does the reason matter? Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or the beginning of something that might eventually become trust. To me, yes. White people always have reasons. Usually those reasons end with dead Apaches. The bluntness of it made her blink, but she didn't look away. Fair enough. Then here's my reason, as honest as I can make it. I'm trying to do what I think is right. Whether I succeed or fail, whether you believe me or not, that's the truth of it. Truth is a white man's word. Like justice, like mercy. The meaning changes depending on who speaks it, perhaps. But you're stuck with me now, so you might as well hope I mean what I say. The corner of his mouth might have twitched, almost a smile, or perhaps just acknowledgement of the absurdity of their situation. Before he could respond, Major Dalton stepped forward, his patience clearly exhausted. Miss Hartwell, if you're quite finished with your introductions, I'll need to provide you with the prisoners, the contract workers' personal effects. Such as they are, a soldier brought forward a small canvas bag, the contents barely enough to make it bulge. Dalton accepted it and handed it to Eleanor with obvious reluctance. His belongings were mostly disposed of at capture. This is what remains. Eleanor opened the bag and looked inside. A thin blanket, worn to the point of being nearly transparent. A bone-handled knife that had been confiscated and tagged with a red warning ribbon. A few pieces of worked leather, their purpose unclear. And at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of soft deerskin, a small carved figure, a horse no larger than her thumb, detailed with the kind of patience that spoke of long hours and careful hands. She looked up at Nahilzai and saw something in his face shift when he realized she'd found the carving. It was the first crack in his otherwise impenetrable composure, a hint of vulnerability, that made him suddenly seem less like a dangerous predator and more like a man who'd lost everything except a small wooden horse that fit in the palm of his hand. Eleanor closed the bag carefully and held it out to him. Your property. Keep it safe. He took the bag slowly, his fingers brushing hers briefly. His hands were calloused and scarred, but the touch was surprisingly gentle. This is mine. Of course it's yours. I may own your labor for 10 years, but I don't own your memories or the things that matter to you. Dalton made a sound of disgust. Miss Hartwell, I really must protest. Your protest is noted, Major. Is there anything else that requires my attention here, or may we leave? The Major looked like he wanted to say considerably more, but discipline won out. You're free to go, but I'm making a note in my official report that I advised against this arrangement in the strongest possible terms. When this ends badly, and it will end badly, I want it on record that I tried to prevent it. Duly noted. Major, good day. Eleanor turned and began walking toward the edge of the plaza. Her back straight, her steps measured and even. After a moment's hesitation, Nahilzai followed her, the canvas bag clutched in one hand. The crowd parted before them like water before the prow of a ship, people drawing back with expressions that ranged from horror to fascination to something that might have been reluctant admiration. As they walked, the whispers followed them like a physical presence. She's gone mad. That savage will murder her in her sleep. Someone should stop this, but no one did. They just watched, as the prim schoolteacher and the dangerous Apache warrior walked side by side out of the plaza and into an uncertain future that neither could possibly predict. The walk from the plaza to the schoolhouse took 15 minutes, though it felt like hours. Eleanor maintained her measured pace, refusing to hurry, despite the weight of curious stares that followed them through Fort Prescott's dusty streets. Nahilzai walked 3 steps behind and to her left. A positioning that she'd later learn was deliberate. It allowed him to watch both her and any potential threats while keeping his hands free. The schoolhouse stood at the northern edge of town, a single-story wooden structure painted white that was already showing signs of weathering after just 2 years. It was a simple building, one large classroom that could hold 30 students when necessary, a small office that doubled as Eleanor's private quarters, and a storage room that smelled perpetually of chalk dust and old books. Behind the main building sat a smaller structure that had originally served as a stable before the previous teacher had kept a horse. It was empty now, containing nothing but old straw and the ghosts of departed animals. Eleanor stopped at the front steps and turned to face Nahilzai directly. In the softer light away from the plaza's harsh glare, she could see details she'd missed before. The way his shoulders carried tension like a coiled spring. The slight limp he was trying to hide, probably from some old injury that had never healed properly. The wariness in his eyes that went deeper than simple caution. This was the watchfulness of something that had been hunted for so long it had forgotten how to rest. The small building behind the school will be yours, she said, gesturing toward the old stable. It needs cleaning and some basic repairs, but it has 4 walls and a roof that doesn't leak much. I'll provide bedding, basic furniture, and whatever else you need to make it habitable. He looked at the structure, then back at her, his expression unreadable. You're not keeping me inside the main building? Under watch? Should I? That's what the contract says. Constant supervision. Eleanor pulled the folded contract from her dress pocket and held it up. The contract says I'm responsible for your custody. It doesn't specify how I maintain that custody. I'm choosing to trust that you understand the consequences of escape would be worse than whatever you might gain from it. You don't know me. No, I don't, but I know something about being underestimated and dismissed. I know what it's like when people look at you and see only what they expect to see rather than what's actually there. So I'm going to offer you something nobody else has, a chance to prove that their expectations are wrong. Nahilzai studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face for deception or hidden motives. Whatever he found there made him nod slowly. I could kill you. Take your horse if you have one. Be 30 miles away before anyone knew. Yes, you could. But then you'd spend the rest of your life running, and eventually they'd catch you again. And next time, there won't be a foolish schoolteacher to buy your contract. Next time, it'll be someone who'll work you until you drop and won't care if you die in the process, so you're not foolish. The corner of Eleanor's mouth lifted in something that wasn't quite a smile. Oh, I'm absolutely foolish. I spent my entire savings, 7 years of careful economy, on a man I don't know who'll probably despise me for the presumption of thinking I could help him. But I'm foolish with a purpose, which is better than being sensible and complicit in something I know is wrong. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something else entirely. You have strange ideas about help. In my experience, when white people offer help, they mean control. I'm sure your experience has taught you that. Mine has taught me that sometimes the hardest thing to accept is genuine assistance with no hidden price. We'll both have to adjust our expectations. Eleanor walked to the stable door and pulled it open. The hinges shrieked in protest, and dust motes swirled in the shaft of sunlight that cut through the dimness. Inside, the space was larger than it had appeared from outside, perhaps 12 feet by 15, with a high ceiling that had exposed beams. The walls were solid despite the weathering, and someone had built a small fireplace in one corner that would provide heat during the cold desert nights. It's not much, Eleanor admitted, stepping inside and looking around with a critical eye. But it's private, and privacy is its own kind of wealth out here. Nahilzai followed her inside, moving silently despite his boots on the wooden floor. He examined the space with the same careful attention he'd given everything else, checking the walls for weak points, testing the floor for rot, studying the window to see if it could be secured. It was the assessment of someone who'd spent his life in places where security meant survival. "Why?" he asked finally, turning to face her in the dusty light. The Major asked, "I'm asking, why did you do this?" Eleanor had known this question would come, but having an answer prepared didn't make it easier to voice. She walked to the window and looked out at the desert that stretched beyond the town's edge. All browns and golds and the deep blue shadows of distant mountains. 3 years ago, I came west because I believed in the idea of civilization spreading across the frontier. I believed in education, progress, and the superiority of our ways. I was young and certain and completely ignorant of what that belief cost the people who were here first. She turned back to face him, her hands clasped in front of her in a gesture that was pure schoolteacher primness, though her voice held notes of something more complex. Then I started teaching, and I learned that half my students had lost family members to Apache raids. And I learned that those raids happened because their families had settled on land that wasn't really theirs to take. And I learned that the Apaches had lost 10 times as many to our soldiers and our diseases and our systematic destruction of everything that had sustained them for centuries. "And this made you feel guilty," Nahilzai said, his tone flat. "So you bought an Apache to make yourself feel better about what your people did to mine?" "No." Eleanor's voice sharpened. "Guilt is self-indulgent and ultimately useless. I didn't buy you to assuage my conscience. I bought you because when I saw you standing on that platform, I saw what this territory has become, a place where we've made laws to justify any cruelty, any exploitation, any degradation we can imagine. And I decided that I could either be complicit in that or I could do something about it, even if that something was small and probably futile. So I'm your gesture, your statement. You're a human being who is about to be sold to someone who'd treat you like livestock. That's all that mattered the moment I raised my hand." Nahilzai walked slowly around the space, his fingers trailing along the wall as if testing its reality. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost thoughtful. "Among my people there's a word, shimasani. It means grandmother, but it also means teacher, guide, someone who passes on wisdom. My grandmother was shimasani. She taught me which plants could heal and which could kill. She taught me how to read the sky for weather and the ground for water. She taught me that the strongest warrior isn't always the one with the fastest horse or the sharpest knife." He stopped at the window, looking out at the same view Eleanor had studied moments before. "She told me once that the white people would win, not because they were stronger or braver, but because they didn't see us as human. They saw us as problems to solve or obstacles to remove. She said the day I saw a white person who looked at me and saw another person, that day I'd know the world was changing." Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest. "And now I don't know what I see. Maybe you're what you say. Maybe you're something else. Time will tell." "That's fair." They stood in silence for a moment, two people from worlds that had collided with devastating consequences, trying to find some way to exist in the wreckage. Eleanor was the first to move, stepping back toward the door, with her practical nature reasserting itself. "I'll bring cleaning supplies and bedding. There's a pump behind the main building. The water's clean. I usually have dinner around 6 o'clock. You're welcome to join me, or I can bring food here if you prefer privacy. I'll eat here. For now." "Understood. Is there anything else you need immediately?" Nahilzai reached into the canvas bag and pulled out the bone-handled knife that had been confiscated. He held it up, the blade catching the light. "The Major took this. You signed for my property. That includes this." Eleanor looked at the knife, then at him. Every instinct developed over 30 years of civilized life told her this was dangerous. "You didn't give weapons to prisoners. You didn't arm someone who'd spent years fighting against everything you represented. You didn't hand a knife to a man who could kill you with it before you could scream. She held out her hand. May I? He flipped the knife and offered her the handle. She took it carefully, feeling the weight of it, the balance. The bone was worn smooth from years of handling, and someone had carved intricate patterns into it, geometric designs that probably held meaning she'd never understand. It's beautiful work, she said, turning it to catch the light on the blade. The steel was well maintained despite everything, showing the care of someone who understood that tools deserved respect. My father made it, gave it to me when I was 12. I've carried it for 16 years. Eleanor met his eyes and saw something there that made her decision. She reversed the knife and held it out to him, handle first. Then you should have it back. He took it slowly, his expression shifting through surprise to something that might have been respect. You're either very wise or very stupid, probably some of both. But I meant what I said about trust. This is your property. You have a right to it. Nahilzai slipped the knife into his belt with practiced ease, and Eleanor noticed that having it there changed his posture subtly. He stood easier somehow, as if having that one familiar thing returned had given him back a piece of himself that chains and captivity had taken away. I'll start on the cleaning, Eleanor said, moving toward the door. If you need anything, the schoolhouse door is open. She was halfway across the threshold when his voice stopped her. Miss Hartwell, she turned back. Yes? I won't run, not yet. You paid $50 for my labor. I'll give you that much in value before I decide what comes next. It wasn't a promise of permanent loyalty or even friendship, but it was honest. And Eleanor found that she valued honesty more than empty assurances. That's fair. We'll figure out the rest as we go. She left him there in the dusty stable that would become his home. This dangerous man she'd purchased with 7 years of savings and a decision made in a moment of conviction that she still didn't fully understand. Behind her, Nahilzai stood in the shaft of sunlight, one hand resting on the knife his father had made, and tried to remember the last time anyone had treated him like a person, rather than a problem to be solved. The first week passed in a careful dance of boundaries and unspoken rules. Eleanor rose each morning at 5:30, as she always had, and found that Nahilzai was already awake, sitting on the step of his quarters, watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of copper and gold. She'd nod in acknowledgement. He'd nod back. Neither pushed for more conversation than necessary, both feeling their way through this strange arrangement like travelers crossing a river on uncertain stones. Eleanor had expected resistance, perhaps even hostility. What she got instead was something more complicated, a kind of watchful cooperation that felt less like submission and more like strategy. Nahilzai did what she asked, but he did it in ways that made it clear he was choosing to comply rather than being forced. When she asked him to repair the fence around the school garden, he did so with an efficiency that spoke of someone who'd spent years making temporary shelters that could withstand harsh weather. When she requested help moving the heavy classroom benches for cleaning, he positioned them in ways that improved the room's function beyond what she'd planned. The children arrived on Monday morning with their usual chaos of noise and energy, and Eleanor braced herself for questions about the Apache man who'd been seen around the schoolhouse. But the questions she'd prepared careful answers for never came. Instead, the children simply accepted Nahilzai's presence the way they accepted everything else about their frontier lives, with a pragmatic flexibility that adults had long since lost. Tommy Fletcher, age 8 and already showing signs of his father's ranching expertise, was the first to approach Nahilzai directly. The warrior was replacing rotted boards on the school's front steps when Tommy wandered over with the fearless curiosity of someone too young to understand danger. "Mister, can you teach me how to track?" Nahilzai looked up from his work, hammer paused mid-swing. He studied the boy for a long moment before responding. "Why?" "My pa says Apaches are the best trackers in the world. Says you can follow a man across solid rock and know what he had for breakfast 3 days ago." Your pa exaggerates. But not by much, Tommy grinned, taking this as permission. So can you teach me? Eleanor had been watching from the schoolhouse window, ready to intervene if necessary. But something in the way Nahilzai set down his hammer and gestured for the boy to come closer made her pause. The warrior pointed to the dust near the steps. What do you see? Tommy squinted at the ground. Dirt? Look closer. What walked here this morning? The boy leaned down, his face screwed up in concentration. I don't see nothing. That's because you're looking with your eyes instead of your mind. The ground tells stories if you know how to read them. See this depression? That's where someone stepped, pressing the earth down. The dust is lighter there because the moisture underneath was exposed. And here, he pointed to a barely visible line, this is where something dragged. A stick? Part of someone's coat? Tommy's eyes widened. That's from when Miss Hartwell came out this morning. She was carrying that long curtain rod. Now you're learning. Tracking isn't about seeing everything. It's about seeing what matters and understanding what it means. From that day forward, Tommy became Nahilzai's shadow whenever he wasn't in lessons. And where Tommy went, others followed. Sarah Mitchell wanted to know how to tell directions by the sun. Jacob Reeves asked about making rope from yucca fibers. Even quiet Martha Simpson, who rarely spoke to anyone, approached one afternoon with a bird's nest that had fallen from a tree and asked what kind of bird had made it. Nahilzai answered them all with a patience that surprised Eleanor. He didn't soften his explanations or talk down to them, but he also didn't overwhelm them with information. He taught them as his grandmother had taught him, through observation, through questions, through letting them discover answers rather than simply providing them. Eleanor found herself watching these interactions with a mixture of relief and something else she couldn't quite name. She'd worried that having Nahilzai present would disrupt her classroom, would frighten the children or anger their parents. Instead, the children were learning things no textbook could teach them, and doing so with an enthusiasm they rarely showed for arithmetic or spelling. The parents were another matter entirely. Mrs. Henderson showed up on the third day, her face pinched with disapproval beneath her sunbonnet. She found Eleanor during the lunch break, when the children were outside and Nahilzai was working on replacing the schoolhouse roof. Miss Hartwell, I must speak with you about this situation. Eleanor set down the slate she'd been cleaning and gave the woman her full attention. Of course, Mrs. Henderson, what concerns you? What concerns me? What concerns me is that you've brought a savage onto school property where our children are present. My Tommy came home yesterday talking about tracking and reading the ground like some kind of heathen. I didn't send my son to school to learn Indian ways. With respect, Mrs. Henderson, your son is learning valuable skills that could save his life on the frontier. Knowing how to read sign, understand weather patterns, and survive in harsh conditions. These aren't Indian ways or white ways. They're simply knowledge that's useful in this territory. It's not proper. It's not Christian. And frankly, Miss Hartwell, I'm not the only parent who feels this way. We've been talking, and we're concerned about your judgment in this matter. Eleanor felt her spine straighten, a response that happened whenever someone questioned her competence. I appreciate your concern. However, my contract with the Territorial Education Board gives me authority over all matters related to the operation of this school. Unless you can demonstrate that the children are being harmed or their education is suffering, I'm afraid your concerns, while noted, won't change my decisions. Mrs. Henderson's face flushed. We'll see about that. The school board meets next month, and you can be certain this topic will be raised. I look forward to addressing any questions they might have. Was there anything else? The woman left in a huff of indignation, and Eleanor returned to her work with hands that trembled slightly. She'd known this confrontation would come eventually, but having it arrive so soon felt like standing on the edge of a precipice. One wrong move, one parent complaint too many, and she could lose her position. And if she lost her position, what would happen to Nahilzai? That evening, she mentioned the encounter to him as they shared coffee on the schoolhouse porch. a habit that had developed over the past few days. This quiet end-of-day conversation that neither of them had explicitly agreed to, but both seemed to need. Mrs. Henderson paid me a visit today. She's not pleased with the arrangement. Nahilzai sipped his coffee, a luxury he'd admitted to missing during his years of running. Because I'm teaching her son to track? Because you're Apache and you're here. The tracking is just her excuse. Will she cause problems for you? Possibly, probably. She's influential with some of the other parents. He was quiet for a moment, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. I could leave. Take a contract with someone else. It wouldn't be difficult to arrange. Is that what you want? What I want doesn't matter much, does it? What matters is whether keeping me here costs you everything you've built. Eleanor set down her coffee cup with more force than necessary. Don't do that. Don't make this about sacrifice or nobility. I made a choice with full knowledge of the consequences. I'm not a child who needs protecting from her own decisions. No, you're a stubborn woman who's going to lose her job because she couldn't leave well enough alone. Perhaps. But it will be my job to lose, my choice to have made. You don't get to decide what I can afford to risk. He turned to look at her then, and in the lamplight spilling from the schoolhouse window, his face showed something that might have been frustration or might have been respect. You're impossible. I've been told that before. Usually by people who expect women to be reasonable, by which they mean compliant. I've never been particularly good at either, I noticed. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of comfortable quiet that develops between people who've begun to understand each other's rhythms. It was Nahilzai who finally broke it, his voice contemplative in the darkness. Among my people, we have stories about tricksters, Coyote mostly, who's always getting into trouble by being too clever or too bold. My grandmother used to say that Coyote survived, not because he was strongest, but because he understood that sometimes the rules needed breaking. That sometimes the only way forward was to do something no one expected. Am I Coyote in this story? Maybe we both are. Breaking rules neither of us made, trying to survive in a world that doesn't want us to. Eleanor considered this. I've never thought of myself as a trickster. That's because white people have different words. Reformer, progressive, troublemaker, but it's all the same thing. Someone who sees the way things are and decides it's not good enough. Is that a compliment or a criticism? It's an observation. Whether it's foolish or wise, I don't know yet. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. A rider approached from town, moving fast enough to raise dust, but not so fast as to suggest emergency. He pulled up at the schoolhouse gate, and in the lamplight Eleanor recognized Samuel Cross, a clerk from the territorial office. Miss Hartwell, got a message for you from the territorial board. Eleanor rose and walked to the gate, accepting the sealed envelope Cross handed down to her. Thank you, Mr. Cross. Ma'am. He tipped his hat, cast a nervous glance toward where Nahilzai sat in the shadows, and rode back toward town without further conversation. Eleanor broke the seal and unfolded the letter, angling it toward the light to read. Her face remained carefully neutral as she scanned the contents, but Nahilzai saw her jaw tighten slightly. Bad news. The school board has called an emergency meeting for this Saturday to discuss concerns raised by several parents about the presence of a contracted laborer on school property. She looked up from the letter. They're going to try to remove you from here. What will you do? Eleanor folded the letter precisely and tucked it into her pocket. I'm going to that meeting, and I'm going to explain to them exactly why their concerns are based on prejudice rather than legitimate safety issues. I'm going to present evidence of the children's improved engagement and learning, and I'm going to remind them that my contract gives me operational authority over this school, and if that doesn't work, then I'll find out how principled I really am, won't I? She said it lightly, but they both understood the weight of it. Eleanor was staking her entire career, her livelihood, and her future in the territory on a decision she'd made in a moment of conviction. There would be no going back from this, no way to undo the consequences if she'd miscalculated. Nahilzai stood and walked to where she stood by the gate. In the dim light, his face was serious, the usual guardedness replaced by something more direct. "Why are you doing this, really? Not the noble reasons you told me before. The real reason." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Because I'm tired of being afraid. I've spent my whole life being the proper daughter, the dutiful teacher, the respectable woman who never makes waves or causes trouble. And somewhere along the way, I realized that being safe and being alive aren't the same thing. When I saw you on that auction platform, I saw someone who'd chosen to live on his own terms, even when it meant hardship and danger. And I thought, maybe it's time I did the same. That's honest, at least. I told you I'd be honest. Even when it makes me sound selfish, it doesn't sound selfish. It sounds human." He turned back toward his quarters, then paused at the door. "Miss Hartwell, when you go to that meeting, tell them the truth. Tell them I'm teaching their children things that might save their lives someday. Tell them I've done nothing to threaten or harm anyone since I've been here. And tell them that if they force you to send me away, they're proving that fear is stronger than reason in this territory." "You think that will convince them?" "No, but it needs to be said anyway." He disappeared into the darkness of his quarters, and Eleanor stood alone in the lamplight, holding a letter that might end everything she'd built here. But instead of fear, she felt something else, a kind of fierce determination that she'd never known she possessed. Saturday would come, the school board would have their say, and she would fight for what she believed was right, regardless of the cost, because Nahilzai was correct about one thing. Sometimes the rules needed breaking, and she'd discovered that she was very good at breaking them when it mattered. Saturday arrived with the kind of bright, cloudless sky that made everything seem deceptively peaceful. Eleanor dressed with particular care that morning, choosing her most severe grey dress and pinning her hair back so tightly it pulled at her temples. She wanted to project authority, competence, and a seriousness of purpose that would be difficult to dismiss. The school board meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock at the territorial courthouse, the same building where she'd signed Nahilzai's contract papers just 2 weeks earlier. Nahilzai watched her preparations from the doorway of his quarters, his expression unreadable. "You look like you're going to war." "Perhaps I am. Just a different kind than you're used to. War is war. The weapons change, but the stakes are always the same. Survival." Eleanor picked up her leather portfolio containing student progress reports, attendance records, and carefully documented examples of improved engagement since Nahilzai had begun working at the school. "I'll be back by noon. Whatever happens, don't leave the property. If they're looking for excuses to cause trouble, absence would be one. I'll be here." She walked to town with her spine straight and her chin up, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed her passage. Fort Prescott had grown accustomed to Eleanor Hartwell as the quiet, competent schoolteacher who kept to herself and caused no trouble. This new version, the woman who'd purchased an Apache warrior and refused to apologize for it, made people uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite articulate. The courthouse meeting room was already half full when she arrived. Eleanor recognized most of the faces, parents of her students, prominent merchants, ranchers who served on various civic committees. The school board itself consisted of 5 members: Chairman Walter Briggs, a banker who'd been in the territory since before it had proper roads; Reverend John Matthews, pastor of the First Methodist Church; Dr. Harrison Webb, the town's only physician; Margaret Caldwell, widow of a prominent cattleman, and one of only 2 women with any official authority in the territory; and Daniel Thornton, nephew of the territorial governor, and a man who'd made his distaste for Eleanor's decision abundantly clear. Eleanor took a seat in the front row, setting her portfolio on her lap and folding her hands over it with deliberate calm. Around her, conversations died down as people noticed her arrival. The silence that replaced them felt heavy with anticipation, like the air before a thunderstorm. Chairman Briggs called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with shrewd eyes and the kind of practiced neutrality that came from years of balancing competing interests. This emergency session of the Territorial School Board has been convened to address concerns raised by multiple citizens regarding the presence of a contracted Apache laborer on school property. Miss Eleanor Hartwell, as the school teacher in question, you're invited to address the board first. Eleanor rose smoothly, moving to stand before the raised platform where the board members sat. She opened her portfolio and removed several sheets of paper, which she distributed to each board member with efficient precision. Members of the board, what you're holding are attendance records for the past 2 weeks compared to the same period last year. You'll note that attendance has improved by 18%. Additionally, I've documented instances of increased student engagement, particularly among boys who previously showed minimal interest in their studies. Reverend Matthews peered at the papers with obvious skepticism. Miss Hartwell, surely you're not suggesting that an Apache savage is responsible for improved attendance. I'm suggesting that practical skills instruction, provided by someone with relevant expertise, has made school more valuable to students and their families. The children are learning tracking, plant identification, weather prediction, and survival skills that have direct application to their lives in this territory. Daniel Thornton leaned forward, his young face already showing the petulant lines that came from a life of assumed privilege. Let me be clear, Miss Hartwell. Are you saying this Indian is teaching our children? I'm saying that Nahilzai is providing supplementary instruction in areas where my knowledge is limited. I'm a competent teacher of reading, writing, arithmetic, and history. I'm not competent to teach frontier survival skills. He is. That's precisely the problem. Thornton's voice rose sharply. We didn't establish territorial schools to have Apache warriors teaching white children heathen ways. We established them to spread civilization, not to encourage backsliding into savagery. Margaret Caldwell spoke for the first time, her voice cool and measured. Mr. Thornton, I'd appreciate it if you'd moderate your language. Name-calling doesn't advance productive discussion. With respect, Mrs. Caldwell, I think my language accurately reflects the severity of this situation. Miss Hartwell has violated every standard of propriety and good judgment. She's exposed our children to a known hostile, compromised the dignity of her position, and frankly, become an embarrassment to this community. Eleanor felt anger flare hot in her chest, but she kept her voice level. Mr. Thornton, Nahilzai has been at the school for 2 weeks. In that time, has there been a single incident of violence, a single threat, a single reason to believe any child has been endangered? The man's presence alone is reason enough. He's killed soldiers. He's raided settlements. The fact that he hasn't acted yet doesn't mean he won't. Dr. Webb cleared his throat, drawing attention from the brewing argument. Miss Hartwell, I'd like to understand your reasoning more clearly. You spent a considerable sum, your entire savings, I'm told, to purchase this man's contract. Why, what did you hope to accomplish? It was a fair question, and Eleanor appreciated that it came without the loaded hostility of Thornton's accusations. Dr. Webb, I acted on 2 principles. First, that the auction itself was morally wrong regardless of its legal standing. Second, that if someone was going to purchase Nahilzai's contract, it should be someone who would treat him with basic human dignity. Noble sentiments, Reverend Matthews interjected. But Miss Hartwell, nobility of purpose doesn't excuse poor judgment. You're an unmarried woman living alone with a male Apache. Surely you must see how this appears to the community. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor felt her face flush, but she met the Reverend's eyes steadily. Nahilzai lives in separate quarters behind the school. Our interactions are entirely professional and occur in full view of anyone who cares to observe. If you're suggesting impropriety, Reverend, I'd ask you to provide evidence rather than innuendo. I'm suggesting that appearances matter, Miss Hartwell. A school teacher must be above reproach, and your current situation raises questions that reflect poorly on both you and this institution. Margaret Caldwell spoke again, and Eleanor caught something in her tone that might have been sympathy. Miss Hartwell, I think what my colleagues are trying to express, albeit inelegantly, is concern for your welfare as well as the children's. You're a woman alone in a difficult situation. Have you considered what happens if this arrangement becomes unmanageable? Eleanor understood the subtext. Mrs. Caldwell was offering her an exit, a way to back down while saving face. But backing down meant sending Nahilzai to someone who might work him to death or worse. It meant admitting that fear and prejudice should govern decisions rather than principle. Mrs. Caldwell, I appreciate your concern, but I entered this arrangement with full understanding of its challenges. I'm managing quite well, and I see no reason to alter the current situation. Thornton slammed his hand on the table. This is absurd. We're dancing around the real issue. Miss Hartwell has demonstrated catastrophically poor judgment, and she needs to be removed from her position before she does lasting damage to our educational system. Chairman Briggs raised his gavel. Mr. Thornton, that's not a decision we're prepared to make at this meeting. Miss Hartwell has a contract that guarantees her position absent clear evidence of incompetence or misconduct. She brought a savage onto school property. How is that not misconduct? Because, Dr. Webb said quietly, she's within her legal authority to hire contracted laborers for school maintenance. And because, as she's pointed out, there's been no actual harm done. Offense taken isn't the same as harm caused. The room erupted in overlapping voices. Parents who'd remained silent until now began shouting questions and complaints. Mrs. Henderson stood up, her voice cutting through the chaos. My son came home talking about spirit animals and reading signs in nature. That's pagan nonsense, and I won't have my child exposed to it. Eleanor turned to face the crowd. Mrs. Henderson, your son learned to identify poisonous plants and find water in desert terrain. Those are practical survival skills, not religious instruction. If Tommy chooses to romanticize that knowledge, that's a matter for parental guidance, not educational policy. Another parent called out, What happens when that Indian decides he's tired of being civilized? What happens when he takes a scalp, or steals a horse, or decides to run back to his people? Then I'll be responsible for those consequences, as the contract stipulates. But I'm betting my career and my reputation that it won't happen. That should tell you something about my confidence in the arrangement. Reverend Matthews stood, his considerable bulk lending weight to his words. Miss Hartwell, confidence isn't the same as wisdom. The scripture tells us, pride goeth before destruction, and an haughty spirit before a fall. I fear you're courting disaster through stubborn unwillingness to acknowledge the danger you've created. And scripture also tells us to show mercy and compassion. Reverend, to treat others as we wish to be treated. I'm simply applying those principles consistently, rather than limiting them to people who look like us. The meeting dissolved into arguments that went in circles, accusations met with rebuttals, fears countered with facts, prejudice dressed up as practical concern. After 2 exhausting hours, Chairman Briggs called for order with increasingly forceful gavel strikes. This meeting is accomplishing nothing productive. The board will take the concerns raised under advisement and reconvene in 1 week to discuss potential actions. Miss Hartwell, you're directed to continue your duties as normal until further notice. This meeting is adjourned. Eleanor gathered her papers and walked out of the courthouse into the harsh midday sun. She'd won a temporary reprieve, but the threat hadn't disappeared. It had simply been postponed. As she walked back toward the school, she noticed people watching her from doorways and windows, their expressions ranging from sympathy to outright hostility. She was halfway home when a voice called out from behind her. Miss Hartwell, might I walk with you? She turned to find Dr. Webb hurrying to catch up, his medical bag swinging from one hand. He was a man in his early 40s, with thinning hair and kind eyes that had seen too much suffering to judge others harshly. Dr. Webb, I appreciate your support there. I'm not sure I'd call it support. More like reluctance to join a mob. He fell into step beside her, adjusting his pace to match hers. But I wanted to speak with you privately about something that concerns me. Another lecture about poor judgment? No, a warning about Daniel Thornton. Webb lowered his voice, though the street was largely empty. Thornton isn't just concerned about propriety or the children's welfare. He's got political ambitions that require him to appear tough on Indian affairs. You've given him an opportunity to grandstand, and he's going to exploit it. I gathered that from his performance today. It's more than that. Thornton has connections to some unsavory characters, men who'd be happy to solve this problem in ways that don't require board approval or legal process. I'm telling you this not to frighten you, but because you need to be careful. Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face the doctor directly. Are you saying someone might try to harm Nahilzai? I'm saying that accidents happen on the frontier, and sometimes those accidents are remarkably convenient for certain parties. Just be vigilant. Lock your doors. Keep track of comings and goings. And if anything seems wrong, don't hesitate to seek help. He tipped his hat and turned back toward town, leaving Eleanor standing alone on the dusty street with her portfolio clutched to her chest and a cold knot of worry forming in her stomach. She'd anticipated legal challenges and social disapproval, but violence? That was a threat she hadn't fully prepared for. She hurried the rest of the way to the schoolhouse, her mind racing through contingencies and precautions. When she arrived, she found Nahilzai sitting on the school steps, a piece of wood in his hands, and his knife working with precise, careful strokes. He was carving something. She couldn't tell what yet, but the focus in his expression suggested it was important. He looked up as she approached, reading her face with the same skill he read tracks in the dust. Badly? Not as badly as it could have been, but not well either. We have a week before they meet again to decide what to do about us, and in the meantime, Eleanor sat down on the step beside him, suddenly exhausted from the morning's confrontation. In the meantime, we prove them wrong. We show that this arrangement works, that you're not a threat, that I haven't lost my mind. And if we can't prove that in a week, then we'll face whatever comes next together. Nahilzai returned his attention to his carving, but Eleanor saw the slight easing of tension in his shoulders. It wasn't trust, not exactly, but it was partnership, recognition that they were bound together in this fight, whether they'd chosen it or not. The danger was building like storm clouds on the horizon. But for now, sitting in the afternoon sun, with a carved wooden figure taking shape in his hands, they had peace, and Eleanor intended to use every moment of it to prepare for whatever storm was coming. The attack came on Thursday night. 3 days before the school board's scheduled final meeting, Eleanor had stayed late grading arithmetic tests by lamplight. The familiar scratch of her pen, the only sound in the quiet schoolhouse. Nahilzai was in his quarters, though she'd seen lamplight there as well. He often carved late into the evening, creating small figures that he never explained, and she never asked about. It had become their routine, this companionable silence across the schoolyard, each working on their own tasks, while somehow being less alone than either had been before. She didn't hear them coming. The first indication of trouble was the sudden crash of breaking glass as something heavy smashed through the schoolhouse window. Eleanor jerked back from her desk, her hand knocking over the inkwell and sending black liquid spreading across her students' papers. The object that had broken the window lay on the floor, a rock the size of a man's fist, wrapped in paper and tied with twine. Her hands shook as she unwrapped it. The message was written in crude block letters. Indian lover, send him back or burn with him. The second rock came through the opposite window before she could process the first. Then another. Then the sound of men's voices outside, rough with whiskey and emboldened by darkness and numbers. Come out, Schoolmarm! Time to discuss your pet savage. We're doing you a favor, saving you from your own foolishness. Eleanor's mind raced. She was alone in the schoolhouse with no weapon except her own determination. The men outside, she counted at least 5 distinct voices, were drunk and angry and convinced they were righteous. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away. Too far to hear her scream over their shouting, she moved to blow out the lamp, hoping darkness would give her an advantage. But before her fingers reached the wick, the door exploded inward. 3 men burst through, their faces shadowed by hat brims and bandanas tied across their noses and mouths. She recognized one by his build, Luther Dawson, a ranch hand known for drinking and picking fights. The others were strangers, or at least smart enough to disguise themselves more thoroughly. "Well now," Dawson said, his words slurred. "Here she is. The righteous Miss Hartwell who thinks she's better than everyone else. Get out of my school." Eleanor's voice was steadier than she felt. "You're trespassing and I'll have the marshal." "The marshal?" One of the other men laughed. "Marshal's drinking at the saloon with half the town. Nobody's coming to save you, sweetheart. And nobody's going to cry too much when the Apache problem takes care of itself tonight." The implications hit her like cold water. "If you've hurt him, haven't touched him yet. Thought we'd start with you, see if that brings him running. Bet that savage has a soft spot for his savior. Apaches are sentimental like that, I hear." Eleanor's hand closed around the first thing she could reach, a heavy geography textbook. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was something. "You're going to leave now. Before you do something you'll regret. Only regret is that decent folks have been too patient with you." Dawson moved closer, and Eleanor could smell the whiskey on him, sharp and sour. "Time to learn what happens when women forget their place." He reached for her arm, and Eleanor swung the textbook with every ounce of strength she possessed. It connected with his jaw with a solid thud that sent him staggering backward, cursing. The other two men started forward, and Eleanor grabbed another book, backing toward the corner where her desk offered some protection. "Touch me, and I'll make sure every newspaper from here to Boston knows about it. I'll describe each of you in perfect detail. The third man lunged for her, and Eleanor threw the book at his face. It struck him across the nose, and he howled, blood spurting between his fingers. But there were still two of them standing, and Dawson had recovered. His face twisted with rage that went beyond drunken bravado into something genuinely dangerous. "You shouldn't have done that." The door to the schoolhouse, still hanging on its broken hinges, suddenly filled with a new presence. Nahilzai stood framed in the lamplight, and for the first time Eleanor saw him as the men in the plaza must have seen him, as something primal and dangerous, all civilized pretense stripped away. His father's knife was in his hand, the blade catching the lamplight like captured lightning. The change in the room's atmosphere was instant and electric. The men who'd been advancing on Eleanor froze, their drunken courage evaporating in the face of the reality they'd spent 2 weeks trying to ignore. This wasn't a tame Indian doing manual labor. This was Nahilzai, warrior, whose name mothers used to frighten children into obedience. "Leave." His voice was soft, which somehow made it more terrifying than if he'd shouted. "Now," Dawson tried to salvage his dignity, "you threaten us with that knife, savage, and you'll hang before sunrise. 3 men attack a woman alone in her home. I defend her. Who do you think the marshal will believe?" It was a gamble, and they all knew it. The law in the Arizona Territory had never been particularly friendly to Apaches, regardless of circumstances. But the men also knew that Eleanor could testify, that their attack had witnesses, that their carefully planned intimidation had gone badly wrong. The man with the bleeding nose made the decision for them. "This ain't worth it. Let's go. We're not done here," Dawson snarled, but he was backing toward the door even as he said it. "This isn't over, Schoolmarm. You and your pet savage both. It is for tonight." Nahilzai moved aside just enough to let them pass, but his knife never wavered. The 3 men stumbled out into the darkness, their threats and curses fading as they ran for their horses. The moment they were gone, Eleanor's legs gave out. She slid down the wall to sit on the floor among broken glass and scattered papers, her whole body shaking with reaction. Nahilzai moved quickly, checking the broken windows and door before kneeling beside her. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, not trusting her voice. Her hands were still clenched into fists, her knuckles white and aching. Eleanor. It was the first time he'd used her given name. "Look at me." She raised her eyes to his, and the gentleness she saw there nearly undid her completely. This man who'd been so feared, so dangerous, was looking at her with concern that had nothing to do with duty or contract or strategic alliance. "I'm fine. Just give me a moment." He stood and moved through the schoolhouse with efficient purpose, lighting additional lamps and checking every shadow. Then he disappeared outside, and Eleanor heard him moving around the building, securing what could be secured. When he returned, he carried a blanket from his quarters. "Come on. You can't stay here tonight. Not with broken windows and a door that won't lock." "Where?" "My quarters. I'll sleep outside to keep watch." "You need rest, and you need to be somewhere secure." Eleanor wanted to argue, to insist on propriety and maintaining proper appearances. But the adrenaline was draining away, leaving her exhausted and scared in ways she couldn't quite process. She let him help her to her feet and guide her across the schoolyard to the small building that had become his home. Inside, it was simple but surprisingly comfortable. He'd made improvements over the past 2 weeks. A proper bed frame, constructed from salvaged lumber, shelves for his few possessions, even curtains that provided privacy from curious eyes. The carved figures she'd glimpsed him working on were arranged on a shelf, a growing collection of horses, birds, and human forms that showed remarkable skill. Nahilzai settled her on the bed and wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. "I'll make coffee." "You're in shock. The warmth will help. You don't have to." "Yes, I do. You defended me tonight. You could have told them where I was, bought yourself safety at my expense. Instead, you fought them. I hit one with a geography textbook. Not exactly heroic. You stood your ground against 3 men who meant you harm. That's the definition of heroic." He busied himself with the small stove in the corner, his movements practiced and efficient. "My grandmother used to say that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being terrified and doing what needs to be done anyway." Eleanor watched him work. This man who'd been strangers 3 weeks ago and now felt like the only solid thing in a world that had gone dangerously unstable. They're going to come back. Maybe not tonight, but soon. And next time, they'll be more organized, more prepared. I know. The school board meeting is in 3 days. If we can just survive until then, Eleanor. He turned to face her, coffee pot in hand. The school board isn't going to save you. You know that, even if they rule in your favor. Men like Dawson don't care about official decisions. They care about what they think is right, and they think removing me from here, by force if necessary, is right. Then what do we do? He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and brought one to her. We have choices. I can leave, take my chances with another contract holder, or try to disappear into Mexico. You'd be safe then. No. The word came out fierce and immediate. Absolutely not. I didn't buy your contract just to hand you over to the next person willing to abuse you, even if staying puts you in danger. Especially then. Because if I back down now, I'm admitting they were right. I'm saying that fear and prejudice should govern our choices. I'm betraying everything I claim to believe in. Nahilzai sat on the floor across from her, his back against the wall, his coffee cup cradled in his scarred hands. You're stubborn. It's going to get you killed someday. Maybe. But at least I'll die standing up instead of on my knees. They sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee that was strong enough to strip paint and feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down on them. Outside, the night sounds continued, crickets, a distant coyote, the whisper of wind through the desert sage. The world didn't care about their problems. It just kept turning, indifferent to human drama. There's another option. Nahilzai's voice was quiet, almost reluctant. We could make this real. Real? The contract makes you my employer. That's a business arrangement, easily dismissed by people who don't respect either of us. But if we were married... He let the suggestion hang in the air between them. Eleanor stared at him, certain she'd misheard. You're suggesting we get married? I'm suggesting we claim we're already married. Common law marriage is legal in the territory. We've been living on the same property for 3 weeks. No one can prove we haven't been sharing quarters. If we present ourselves as husband and wife, it changes everything. It's insane. It's strategic. As my wife, you have legal protection. They can't easily remove me without your consent. And attacking you becomes attacking a man's wife, which carries different consequences than attacking a spinster school teacher who made poor choices. Eleanor's mind raced through the implications. It would solve so many problems: the social impropriety, the custody questions, the vulnerability that came from her unmarried status. But it would also create new complications, new expectations, new ways for things to go terribly wrong. "What about you?" she asked. "What do you gain from this besides keeping your current situation?" "Safety, legitimacy, a reason to be here that doesn't involve chains and contracts and constant suspicion." He met her eyes directly. "And maybe something else. Maybe the chance to build something that matters, with someone who sees me as human, rather than as a problem to be solved. This is crazy. Yes, the school board will never believe it. They'll believe what we tell them. People see what they expect to see. Right now they expect scandal and impropriety. We'll give them a love story instead. A respectable widow. I'm not a widow, you are now. Your husband died back east. You came west to start fresh. You met me under tragic circumstances and saw past what everyone else saw. It's romantic. It fits the narrative people want to believe in. Eleanor wanted to argue, to point out all the ways this plan could fail. But she was exhausted and scared and out of better options. And somewhere beneath the fear and practical concerns, she felt something else, a spark of possibility, of wondering what it might mean to tie her life to someone who understood what it meant to stand against the world. "If we do this," she said slowly, "it has to be real, not just a legal fiction. I won't lie to the school board about marriage and then maintain separate lives. If we're going to claim this, we commit to it fully, agreed, and we do it as equals. I'm not becoming someone's property just to escape being alone. I wouldn't expect otherwise." Eleanor drained the last of her coffee, then set the cup aside with hands that had finally stopped shaking. "Then we'll announce it at the school board meeting. Let them try to dismiss us then. They'll still try. Of course they will. But at least we'll be fighting from stronger ground." Nahilzai smiled then, a real smile that transformed his face from something carved and distant into something surprisingly warm. "You know, when I stood on that auction block, I thought my life was over. I thought the best I could hope for was a quick death. I never imagined, what? Maybe defeat could be the beginning of something worth fighting for." Eleanor felt an answering smile tug at her own lips. "Neither did I." Outside, the night sounds continued. Inside, two people who'd been strangers a month ago made a choice that would change both their lives in ways neither could fully predict. It was desperate, it was strategic, and maybe, just maybe, it was also something more. The morning of the school board meeting arrived with unexpected witnesses. Eleanor and Nahilzai walked into town together, side by side, rather than the careful distance they'd maintained before. Word of the attack had spread through Fort Prescott like wildfire, and people lined the street to watch them pass. Some faces showed sympathy, others showed disapproval. Both showed simple curiosity about what would happen next. Dr. Webb intercepted them 2 blocks from the courthouse. "Miss Hartwell, I need to examine you. Document any injuries from the attack." Eleanor touched her bruised arm, where Dawson had grabbed her. "I'm fine, Doctor. With respect, you're not fine, and we need evidence. The marshal is finally taking this seriously after I reported what those men did. Your testimony matters, but physical proof matters more." They followed him to his office, where he carefully documented the bruises, the scrapes from broken glass, and the strain in her wrist from swinging the textbook. He wrote everything in his precise medical hand, creating a record that would be difficult to dismiss. "Luther Dawson and his companions will face charges," Webb said as he worked. "Assault, destruction of property, trespassing with intent to harm. The marshal has already arrested 2 of them. And Dawson," Nahilzai asked from where he stood by the door, "still at large. But he won't get far. Half the territory knows his face." At the courthouse, the meeting room was packed beyond capacity. People stood along the walls and crowded in the doorway. Eleanor recognized not just Fort Prescott residents, but people from surrounding ranches and settlements. News traveled fast in the territory, and everyone wanted to see how this scandal would resolve. The school board members sat at their raised table. their faces showing varying degrees of discomfort with the attention. Chairman Briggs looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in a week. Even Daniel Thornton seemed subdued, though his eyes glittered with barely suppressed anticipation. But there were new faces present as well. A man in a dark suit sat in the front row, his bearing suggesting authority that transcended local politics. Beside him sat a woman with steel-grey hair and the kind of severe elegance that spoke of Eastern wealth and education. Eleanor didn't recognize either of them, but their presence changed the atmosphere in ways she couldn't quite define. Briggs called the meeting to order, his gavel strikes uncertain. This session of the Territorial School Board will address the ongoing situation regarding Miss Eleanor Hartwell's employment and the presence of a contracted Apache laborer on school property. However, before we begin, we have visitors from the territorial capital who've requested to address the board. The man in the dark suit rose smoothly. Thank you, Chairman Briggs. I'm Attorney Samuel Richardson, representing the Territorial Governor's Office. And this is Mrs. Catherine Pemberton, Deputy Director of the Territorial Education Commission. A murmur ran through the crowd. The Governor's Office? The Education Commission? This had escalated far beyond a local school board matter. Richardson continued, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being heard. The Governor has taken a personal interest in this case, after reports reached his office about irregularities in the handling of Miss Hartwell's situation. We're here to ensure that territorial law is applied correctly and that no citizens' rights are violated through prejudice or political manipulation. Daniel Thornton's face went pale. Now wait just a moment. Mr. Thornton, you'll have your opportunity to speak. But first, I'd like to address several legal matters that seem to have been overlooked in the rush to judgment. Richardson pulled papers from his leather case. Miss Hartwell's contract as territorial school teacher gives her explicit authority over all operational decisions regarding the school facility. This includes hiring of maintenance staff, contractors and laborers. The presence of Nehilzai on school property is entirely within her legal rights. Reverend Matthews cleared his throat. Surely there are moral considerations beyond mere legal technicalities. Reverend, I'm a lawyer, not a theologian. I deal in law, not morality. And the law is clear. Miss Hartwell has broken no statutes, violated no regulations, and exceeded no authority granted to her by her employment contract. Mrs. Pemberton spoke for the first time, her voice crisp with the kind of educated diction that made Eleanor think of Boston drawing rooms. Furthermore, I've reviewed the educational outcomes from Miss Hartwell's school over the past month. Test scores have improved. Attendance is up significantly. Parent satisfaction, excluding complaints based purely on prejudice, shows marked increases. By every measurable standard, she's excelling at her job. Margaret Caldwell leaned forward with obvious interest. Mrs. Pemberton, are you saying the board has no grounds to remove Miss Hartwell from her position? I'm saying that attempting to do so would constitute wrongful termination based on discrimination. The territorial government would be forced to intervene, and the board members who voted for removal could face personal legal consequences. The room erupted in overlapping voices. Richardson waited for the noise to die down before continuing. However, there's another matter that needs addressing. The attack on Miss Hartwell 3 nights ago represents a serious criminal offense. The men involved, Luther Dawson and his associates, committed assault with intent to cause harm. They also threatened Nehilzai, suggesting an intent to commit violence against him as well. This is exactly what we warned about. Thornton burst out, unable to contain himself any longer. The presence of that Apache has incited violence and disorder. The violence was directed at Miss Hartwell by white men, Mr. Thornton. The Apache you're so concerned about defended her from attack. Perhaps you should consider which group represents the actual threat to public safety. Before Thornton could respond, a commotion at the back of the room announced a new arrival. Marshal Thomas Brennan pushed through the crowd, dragging a handcuffed Luther Dawson behind him. The ranch hand looked worse for wear, bruised, unshaven, and reeking of the horse barn where he'd apparently been hiding. "Found him at the Rocking H Ranch," Brennan announced. "He confessed to the attack and named his accomplices. Claims it was all Thornton's idea." Every eye in the room turned to Daniel Thornton, whose face had gone from pale to crimson. "That's a damned lie. I never—" "Funny thing about desperate men," Brennan continued, his weathered face showing satisfaction. "They tend to turn on whoever put them up to their crimes. Dawson says you provided the whiskey, suggested the timing, and promised you'd make sure no charges stuck. Said you wanted the Apache problem solved permanently." Richardson's eyebrows rose. "Mr. Thornton, that's conspiracy to commit assault, possibly attempted murder. Those are territorial offenses that would require you to stand trial in the capital." Thornton stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly. "This is a setup. You're all conspiring to protect that woman and her savage—" "Sit down, Mr. Thornton." Chairman Briggs' voice cracked like a whip. "You've done enough damage. Marshal, take Mr. Thornton into custody pending investigation of these charges. Now wait, I'm a member of this board. I'm the governor's nephew." "You were a member of this board," Mrs. Pemberton said coldly. "As of this moment, you're suspended pending the outcome of criminal proceedings, and being the governor's nephew won't protect you from consequences of criminal behavior. The governor made that explicitly clear in my instructions." Brennan moved forward to take Thornton's arm, but the young man jerked away, his face twisted with fury and fear. "You're all fools. That Apache is playing you, and that woman is too blinded by her own righteousness to see it. Mark my words, this will end in blood and tears." "The only blood spilled so far has been Miss Hartwell's," Dr. Webb called out from the crowd. "Maybe you should consider who the real threat is." As Brennan led both Thornton and Dawson from the room, a strange silence settled over the assembly. People who'd been certain of their righteous anger just moments before now looked uncertain, questioning. The narrative they'd constructed, the dangerous Apache, the foolish woman, the inevitable tragedy, had been systematically dismantled. Leaving them without convenient villains or simple answers, Eleanor stood, feeling Nahilzai's steadying presence beside her. This was the moment they'd planned for, and despite everything that had happened, she felt oddly calm. "Chairman Briggs, members of the board, I have an announcement to make." Briggs nodded wearily. "Miss Hartwell, the concern about impropriety has been raised multiple times during these proceedings. The suggestion that an unmarried woman cannot properly supervise a male contracted laborer. I'd like to address that concern directly." She took a breath, felt Nahilzai's hand briefly touch her elbow in support. "Nahilzai and I were married 5 days ago in a private ceremony. Under territorial law, our common law marriage is fully legal and binding." The room exploded. Questions, accusations, expressions of shock and disbelief overlapped until Briggs' gavel restored order. When the noise died down, it was Margaret Caldwell who spoke first. "Miss Hartwell, or should I say Mrs., do you have proof of this marriage? We have witnesses who can attest to our cohabitation and mutual declaration of marriage. Dr. Webb has agreed to testify, as have several students who've observed our domestic arrangements. Under territorial statute, that's sufficient for common law recognition." Webb stood. "I can confirm that I've witnessed them living as husband and wife. The relationship appears genuine, based on mutual respect and affection." Reverend Matthews sputtered. "This is highly irregular. Marriage should be performed by clergy, with proper ceremony." "Reverend, with all due respect, half the marriages in this territory started as common law arrangements," Richardson interjected. "Frontier conditions often make formal ceremonies impractical. The law recognizes reality over ritual." Nahilzai spoke for the first time since entering the courthouse, his voice steady and clear. "I married Eleanor because I respect her courage, value her principles, and want to build a life with her. If that's not sufficient reason for marriage, I don't know what is." Mrs. Pemberton smiled slightly. "Well said, what surname are you using?" Eleanor and Nahilzai exchanged glances. They hadn't discussed this detail. After a moment, Nahilzai said, "Hartwell, I'm taking my wife's name. It's legal under territorial statute, and it seems appropriate given that she gave me back my life." The simple statement carried weight that seemed to affect even the most skeptical observers. Here was a warrior who'd fought the U.S. Army to a standstill, choosing to take his wife's name out of respect and gratitude. It was a gesture that transcended culture and spoke to something fundamental about partnership and honor. Briggs looked around at his fellow board members. "Given these developments, I move that we table any discussion of Mrs. Hartwell's employment." All in favor? The vote was unanimous, even Reverend Matthews grudgingly raising his hand. Richardson gathered his papers with evident satisfaction. "The Territorial Governor's Office considers this matter resolved. Mrs. Hartwell will continue her teaching duties without interference. Any future complaints must be based on documented professional misconduct, not on prejudice or personal disapproval of her private life." As the meeting adjourned, people filed out in small groups, their conversations hushed and uncertain. Eleanor and Nahilzai remained seated until the room was mostly cleared. Dr. Webb approached them with a broad smile. "That was masterfully done. Though I suspect you'll face some social difficulties from the more conservative members of the community." Eleanor laughed, surprised by how good it felt. "Doctor, I bought an Apache warrior at auction and married him 3 weeks later. I think social difficulties are a given at this point." "Fair enough. But you've also changed some minds today. Not all, but some. That counts for something." Mrs. Pemberton stopped on her way out, her severe face softening slightly. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'll be including your school in a favorable report to the Territorial Education Commission. What you've accomplished here, integrating practical frontier skills with traditional curriculum, could serve as a model for other territorial schools. You should be proud." After everyone had left, Eleanor and Nahilzai walked out into the bright afternoon sun. They stood on the courthouse steps where, just weeks ago, he'd been sold like property, and she'd made an impulsive decision that had changed both their lives. "So," Nahilzai said quietly, "we're married now." "Apparently so. How do you feel about that?" Eleanor considered the question. She thought about the attack, the fear, the anger, the impossible choice they'd made. But she also thought about coffee shared in the evenings, about watching him teach children with infinite patience, about the way he'd looked at her with genuine concern when she'd been hurt. "I feel," she said slowly, "like maybe we've stumbled into something real while trying to solve a practical problem." "I was thinking the same thing." They walked back toward the school together, and for the first time, Nahilzai took her hand. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. A public declaration, a promise, a beginning. 6 months passed, and Fort Prescott learned to live with what it had once considered impossible. The schoolhouse underwent changes, both subtle and profound. The broken windows had been replaced with stronger glass, and Nahilzai had built shutters that could be secured from inside. A practical response to violence that served as a quiet reminder of what had happened and what they'd survived. The classroom itself had evolved into something unique in the Arizona Territory, a space where McGuffey readers shared shelf space with desert plant specimens, where arithmetic lessons incorporated navigation by stars, and where history included perspectives that most territorial schools never acknowledged. Eleanor stood at the chalkboard on a warm April morning, watching her students work through a geography exercise. But this wasn't the rote memorization of state capitals and river names that characterized most frontier education. Her students were drawing maps of the land surrounding Fort Prescott, marking water sources, identifying terrain features, noting seasonal changes that affected travel and survival. It was practical knowledge that might save their lives someday, taught alongside traditional academics in a way that made both more meaningful. Tommy Fletcher, now 9 and taller by several inches, raised his hand. "Mrs. Hartwell, can Mr. Hartwell tell us about the time he tracked those outlaws for the marshal last month?" Eleanor glanced toward the back of the classroom where Nahilzai sat repairing broken desks, a task he'd taken on with the same patient competence he brought to everything. His presence in the classroom had become so normal that the children barely noticed him anymore. Though visitors to the school were often shocked to find an Apache quietly working, while white children recited their lessons. That's a question for him. Tommy, though perhaps after lessons are complete, we still have mathematics to finish. The tracking of the outlaws had been a turning point of sorts. 3 men had robbed the Wells Fargo office and fled into the desert, confident that the rocky terrain would hide their trail. Marshal Brennan had asked Nahilzai for help, a request that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Together, they'd found the thieves in 2 days, recovering the stolen money and earning Nahilzai a grudging respect from men who'd once called for his removal. It hadn't made him popular. Nothing could have accomplished that miracle. But it had made him necessary, and necessity had a way of trumping prejudice when practical concerns demanded it. Ranchers who'd spoken against Eleanor now quietly asked Nahilzai's advice about reading weather signs. Mothers who'd pulled their children from school in protest had returned when they realized their children were falling behind peers who'd stayed. The transformation wasn't complete or universal. There were still families who refused to send their children to what Reverend Matthews called that heathen school. There were still men who wouldn't shake Nahilzai's hand or meet his eyes. But the casual expectation of violence had faded, replaced by a wary coexistence that felt almost like acceptance on particularly optimistic days. After school ended and the children had scattered into the afternoon sunshine, Eleanor found Nahilzai on the front porch, working on a new carving. His collection had grown considerably over the months, and several families now owned small wooden figures he'd made, gifts given without fanfare, but received with surprising appreciation. "You're making a horse again," she observed, settling beside him on the step they'd come to think of as theirs. "Mrs. Fletcher asked if I could make one for Tommy's birthday. She offered to pay, but I told her it was a gift. That's kind of you. She brings us bread every week." Kindness for kindness. He turned the carving to catch the light, checking the proportions. "Besides, I like making them. It reminds me of better times, before everything became about survival." Eleanor watched his hands work, still marveling at the dexterity in those scarred fingers. "Do you ever regret it? This life we've built. Regret implies I had better options. I didn't." He paused, considering his words carefully. "But if you're asking whether I'm happy, yes. I didn't expect to be, but I am, even though you're still bound by contract, even though you gave up your freedom for this." "Eleanor, I had no freedom. I was either going to die in a military prison or work myself to death for someone who saw me as livestock. This," he gestured at the school, the town, the life they'd created. "This is more freedom than I've had in 3 years. I choose to be here. That's a different thing than being forced." A rider approached from town, and Eleanor recognized the postal courier. He dismounted and handed her a thick envelope with an official-looking seal. "Letter for you, Mrs. Hartwell. Came all the way from Washington." Eleanor tore it open, scanning the contents quickly. Her eyes widened. "It's from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They want to establish a pilot program, teaching practical integration skills at reservation schools. They're citing our school as a model and asking if we'd be willing to train other teachers." Nahilzai set down his carving. "What does that mean?" "It means people in Washington are paying attention. It means what we're doing here might influence policy across multiple territories." She continued reading. "They're offering funding, official recognition, even suggesting we write a curriculum guide that could be distributed nationally. You'd be good at that. We'd be good at it. You're as much a part of this as I am. More, really. You're the one actually teaching the skills that make our approach valuable. The possibility hung between them. A chance to transform their small rebellion into something larger. Something that might change how the government approached Indian education across the country. It was ambitious, possibly naive, but then again, their entire relationship had been built on ambitious and naive decisions that had somehow worked out. That evening, they hosted dinner for an unlikely group. Dr. Webb, Marshall Brennan, Margaret Caldwell, and surprisingly, Reverend Matthews. The Reverend had softened considerably over the months, particularly after Nehilzai had spent 2 days searching for Matthew's wandering grandfather and brought the old man home safely. Over Eleanor's carefully prepared roast and Nehilzai's surprisingly skillful bread, they discussed the Washington proposal. "You'd be fools to turn it down," Brennan said, helping himself to more potatoes. "What you've done here, it works. God knows the reservation system isn't working. Maybe your way offers something better." "The challenge would be finding teachers willing to try it," Margaret Caldwell observed. "Most wouldn't have Eleanor's courage or Nehilzai's patience." Matthews cleared his throat. "I'll admit I was wrong about many things. I saw danger where there was simply a difference. But I've watched the children in that school, and they're learning not just facts, but wisdom. That's worth supporting, even if it challenges traditional methods." "High praise from someone who called me a heathen 6 months ago," Nehilzai said, but his tone was mild, almost teasing. "I called you several things, and I regret most of them, though I maintain that you could benefit from more regular church attendance." "I attend every Sunday. I sit in the back row and listen to you preach about loving thy neighbor while people pretend I'm not there. Then perhaps the problem isn't your attendance, but their attention," Matthews sighed. "Change comes slowly to places like this, but it does come if stubborn people keep pushing." Webb raised his glass. "Two stubborn people. May they continue, making the rest of us uncomfortable until we become better than we were." They all drank to that. Later, after the guests had left and the dishes were washed, Eleanor and Nehilzai walked out past the school to where the desert stretched endlessly under stars that seemed close enough to touch. It had become their ritual. This evening walk, a time to decompress from the day and simply exist together without the weight of expectations or performances. "If we do this Washington thing," Nehilzai said, "everything changes. We wouldn't be just a local oddity anymore. We'd be a national example with all the scrutiny and pressure that brings." "Are you having second thoughts?" "I'm having complicated thoughts. When I stood on that auction block, my only goal was to survive the next day. Now I'm considering policy decisions that might affect thousands of people. It's disorienting." Eleanor took his hand, the gesture as natural now as breathing. "We don't have to decide tonight. We have time to think about what we want our lives to look like." "What do you want them to look like?" She considered the question, looking up at stars that seemed to arrange themselves into patterns that might be constellations, or might just be random beauty. "I want to keep teaching. I want to prove that different approaches to education can work. I want children to grow up knowing that people from different backgrounds can build something good together." She paused. "And I want to build a life with you that feels real, not just strategic or convenient. It already feels real to me." "Does it?" He turned to face her, his features barely visible in the starlight, but his voice clear and certain. "Eleanor, I've lived through things most people couldn't imagine. I've fought battles, lost family, watched my entire way of life destroyed. I know the difference between surviving and living. This, what we have, this is living. It's complicated and sometimes difficult and definitely not what either of us planned. But it's real." She felt something tighten in her chest, emotion that went beyond gratitude or partnership into territory she'd been afraid to examine too closely. "I think I'm falling in love with you, which seems ridiculous given that we got married out of desperation rather than romance." "Is it ridiculous? Or is it just another thing that happened differently than expected but worked out anyway?" "You're very philosophical tonight." "I'm very happy tonight. There's a difference." They stood in comfortable silence, two people who'd been strangers 7 months ago, enemies by birth and culture, now bound together by choices that had seemed impossible at the time, but inevitable in retrospect. In the distance, Fort Prescott's lights glowed like earthbound stars. Those lights represented people who doubted them, fought them, and eventually, reluctantly or genuinely, accepted them. The town hadn't transformed overnight into some utopia of understanding. Prejudice still existed, fear still colored decisions, but small changes had accumulated into something that looked almost like progress. The school would continue, the children would learn. Washington might adopt their methods or might ignore them entirely. But regardless of what happened next, they'd already accomplished something that mattered. They'd proven that the rules could be broken, that different didn't mean impossible, and that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships created the strongest foundations. Eleanor leaned against Nahilzai's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. This man who'd been chained and auctioned, who'd lost everything and somehow found a way forward. This woman who'd spent $50 and gambled her entire future on a conviction she couldn't fully explain. Together, they'd built something that neither could have created alone. "Whatever we decide about Washington," Eleanor said quietly, "we decide together, as partners, as equals." "As husband and wife," Nahilzai added, and there was wonder in his voice, as if he still couldn't quite believe it was true. "As husband and wife," Eleanor agreed. Above them, the stars continued their eternal dance. Below them, the desert held its ancient secrets. And between those two infinities, two people who'd been given impossible choices had chosen each other. And, in doing so, had chosen hope over fear, possibility over limitation, and love over every logical argument against it. The story that had begun on an auction block, with chains and desperation and $50 that seemed both too much and not nearly enough, had transformed into something neither had imagined. Not a fairy tale ending where all problems disappeared, but something better, a real ending where problems persisted but were faced together, where differences remained but were navigated with respect, where the future was uncertain but approached with courage. They walked back toward the school as the night deepened around them, two shadows moving through darkness toward the warm light of home. And if anyone had been watching from town, they would have seen what Fort Prescott was slowly learning to accept, that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply treating another human being as fully human. And sometimes the strongest marriages are built not on romance, but on mutual respect, shared struggle, and the stubborn refusal to accept that different means impossible. The auction had been months ago, the chains had been removed, but the real freedom, the kind that came from building a life worth living rather than just surviving, that was something they'd earned together, day by difficult day, choice by impossible choice. And now, walking into their future under a canopy of desert stars, they carried with them not just their own story, but the possibility that others might follow, might find courage in their example, might believe that the world could be different because they'd proven it already was. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.